If you come to this channel, then clearly you're into true crime just like myself, which is why I like to dig down deep and find stories that none of us have ever heard about yet. You know, people often wonder how many true crime stories can actually be out there, and unfortunately, the answer is an endless amount, because new ones keep on popping up each and every day. And a lot of them just stay regional, and they just never make it to the mainstream. So everything from strange disappearances to all-out massacres, today we got a doozy for you. Here are the most terrifying mysteries you've never heard of. Number 5. The Devil in the Wall.
I liken him to a rabid dog that needs to be put down. He needs to stay in jail for the rest of his life.
If you ever hear a noise in your house or apartment, your ears perk up as you try to listen closer. Is the house just settling, you wonder, or was there a strong gust of wind that shook the foundation? And the noises stop and you go on with your life as normal. At least, that's how it usually goes. But what if those noises continue? And the faint scuttles behind the walls don't stop. You think you hear a voice whisper at one point, and then items start to go missing. Well, that was the type of nightmare the Bowen family lived through in the 1980s. And as it turns out, their noises were not just something they could brush off, because a person had actually moved in. And they were not going to leave until they finished the evil deed they had come to do. And that person was 15-year-old Daniel LaPlante. Daniel grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts, which on the surface is your typical New England spot. Quiet, historical, pretty uneventful. But for Daniel, there was nothing peaceful about growing up there. And by his own account, he had suffered traumas and abuse coming from multiple adults in his life, including his father, stepfather, and even his own psychiatrist. Now, whether all these claims are true is still debated, but either way, Daniel was a deeply disturbed child. He struggled with dyslexia and hyperactivity, with his classmates describing him as weird, off, and just all around unsettling to be around. Teachers noticed that he rarely showered, and rarely smiled, and barely spoke. By the time he hit his early teens, Daniel had started to break into homes, creeping through windows and stealing keepsakes, just soaking up the thrill of being somewhere he didn't belong. He liked the thrill so much that at one point, he decided, he never wanted to leave. In 1986, the year it all went down, 15-year-old Tina Bowen got a phone call. The boy on the other end said that his name was Danny. And he'd gotten her number from a friend, said he was a good-looking athlete and wanted to take her out. And Tina agreed, and when he finally came to pick her up, when she opened the door, she was met with something entirely different. And Daniel LaPlante stood there, disheveled and lanky, with greasy hair and his vacant eyes. The date was awkward, short, and very forgettable, until it turned into something unforgettable. Over the following weeks, Tina began hearing strange noises in her house. Her family noticed items moved or even missing. Doors were open that no one remembered opening. And then came the moment that would traumatize the Bowen family forever. One day, Tina's father, Frank, opened a hallway closet, and there, crammed inside, was Daniel. His face was smeared in ketchup and mayonnaise. His hair spiked like some demonic punk rocker, and in his hands, he held a hatchet and a wrench. He ordered Frank, Tina, and her sister into a bedroom, which they did willingly. But Frank, being much larger than Daniel, wasn't going to let this kid get the best of him. As the three walked in the room, before Daniel could get in, Frank slammed the door shut and locked it. After that, Tina leapt out the window and sprinted to a neighbor's house to call for help. By the time police arrived, Daniel had vanished. They searched the home top to bottom, and what they found made their skin crawl. LaPlante had carved out tunnels in the walls and had been living inside the house, watching the family from within for what investigators believed was at least a year, maybe more. They found food wrappers, bedding, pee bottles, even holes that allowed him to spy on the family through their walls and mirrors. He wasn't just stalking them, and he had fully moved in. After being arrested, Daniel was eventually released on bail, and while living back with his mother and stepfather, he started committing burglaries around the neighborhood once again, and clearly he hadn't learned his lesson. And as a direct result, on December 1st of '87, Andrew Gustafson came home to find his pregnant wife Priscilla dead in her bed, having been shot in the head at close range. And their two children, 7-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William, were drowned, one in the upstairs bathtub and the other downstairs. After a manhunt that involved Daniel taking a woman hostage and stealing her van, eventually he was apprehended and charged with the murders of the Gustafson family. In 1988, LaPlante was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, one for each soul he brutally took. Number 4, vanished in plain sight.
I know that people know. I know somebody out there knows where she is.
The year was 2013, and 26-year-old Tiffany Witten was, by many accounts, struggling. She battled drug addiction on and off for years. Her relationship with her family had grown strained. But despite all that, those who knew her said Tiffany was still hopeful and wanted to turn her life around.
I do honestly feel like she wanted to leave that life. She wanted to turn things around.
She had a young daughter and a mother who still held out hope. And despite her issues, she wasn't someone who just walked away from it all. At least not like this. On September 13th, Tiffany and her boyfriend at the time, Ashley Red Cottle, pulled into a Walmart just off Cobb Parkway in Marietta, Georgia. Security footage shows the two wandering the aisles at around midnight, though this wasn't some quick grocery run. Tiffany could be seen stuffing items into her oversized purse, shoplifting in real time. A habit that, according to Red and others, wasn't all that rare for her. But at some point, store security caught on, and when they approached Tiffany and Red, that's when things took a strange turn. Now, Red would later tell police that as soon as the store employees started asking questions, Tiffany bolted. She ran through the doors, out of the store and into the dark. That was the last time anyone ever saw her. Red claimed he stayed behind and cooperated with the employees and figured Tiffany had just taken off to avoid getting arrested. Maybe she'd meet him back at his mom's house where they'd been staying, and maybe she'd call later. Either way, it wasn't a big deal. But she never showed up and didn't call. In the days that followed, there was no credit card activity from her end, no social media posts, no real signs of life. Now, despite the fact that Tiffany had seemingly vanished into thin air, Red never reported her missing, which is interesting to note. In fact, it would be over a month before anyone filed a missing persons report, and it wasn't Red, it was Tiffany's mom, Lisa. Now, their relationship had been rocky, but Lisa tried to keep tabs on her daughter as best she could. After multiple calls and texts went unanswered, the mother's intuition told her something was wrong, and unfortunately, Lisa was right. When police finally started asking questions, they found themselves in a strange situation. They had security footage of the last time Tiffany was seen. They had her boyfriend, who was with her that night, but no real evidence of foul play. Still, though, the red flags were hard to ignore. And for one, Red had a violent past, a reputation for being abusive, especially when drugs were involved. According to some of Tiffany's friends, their relationship was toxic, and she'd even expressed fear of him in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. And then there was the fact that Red had waited so long to say anything, and when he finally did speak to police, his story was inconsistent. He couldn't say exactly where she went or what direction she ran or what happened after she left the store. He claimed she was paranoid and high that night, that she thought someone was watching her, but to this day, no one has been able to confirm or deny this claim. Over the years, theories have swirled. Did Tiffany OD somewhere and her body quietly get disposed of? And did Red snap that night and then cover his tracks? Or did something else entirely happen? The Walmart parking lot was searched, so were the nearby wooded areas. The police even dug up a backyard at one point based on a tip, but nothing ever came of it. Number 3. The Gitchy Manitou Massacre.
There was gunfire, and when it was over, 4 of them lay dead, slain.
It was supposed to be a night of music, laughter, and friendship underneath the stars. The 5 teenagers, a campfire, and the soft sounds of guitars strumming through the Gitchy Manitou Preserve. But what happened on November 17th of 1973 turned a peaceful park in rural Iowa into an absolute slaughterhouse. And prior to the nightmare that commenced, the preserve was quiet that night. Roger Essam, Stewart, and Dana Bade, Michael Hadrath, and Sandra Chesky, 5 friends from Sioux Falls, had driven into Iowa to spend a night camping. Just a group of teens enjoying a weekend back in the day. But little did they know they were being watched the whole time, and stalked is more like it, by 3 men hiding in the tree line on the ridge above where the camp had been set up. Armed with shotguns were 29-year-old Alan Fryer. His younger brothers were with him, David and James, who were 24 and 21. And the Fryer bros were out that night illegally hunting deer, poaching by spotlight. But when they stumbled across the teens, they found something much more interesting to hunt down. And David crept closer to spy on the group, and then returned with a report that they were smoking weed. And to the Fryers, that was enough to justify what came next. They didn't want any hippy-dippy types hanging around what they considered their land. And they decided to impersonate narcotics officers, steal the teens' weed, and, if their later testimony is to be believed, murder anybody they wanted under the guise of law enforcement, which they thought was legal. And so, at around 10 p.m., the brothers opened fire. The 17-year-old Roger died instantly. 18-year-old Stewart was hit and left crying out, wounded somewhere in the dark. The rest of the group ran, but the Fryers weren't finished. And calling themselves police, they ordered the teens out from the trees. The 15-year-old Michael and 13-year-old Sandra stepped out together. Alan Fryer then shot Michael in the arm, and then forced him to stand, accusing him of playing dead. Sandra was terrified, but she obeyed, and she had no choice, really. The brothers then separated the group, and Sandra, Michael, and 14-year-old Dana Bade were marched down a trail. And Sandra was tied up and thrown into the Fryer's truck, and then Alan drove off with her. Moments after that, shots rang out, and James and David executed everybody who was left behind. Back in the truck, Alan told Sandra he was the boss, the sergeant, so to speak, and that his brothers followed his orders. He would eventually drive her to a remote farmhouse, where his brothers were already waiting in another vehicle. And it was there that James climbed into the truck and had his way with her. And finally, when the brothers were done, they dropped the terrified young girl back in Sioux Falls, telling her she was too young for them to arrest her. The following morning, a couple out for a drive in their new car stumbled across the bodies of Gitchy Manitou. Roger's body lay by the fire, and the others were scattered across the preserve. And perhaps the brothers thought the 13-year-old girl was too scared to say anything, but she went right to the police and stood brave as she told every single brutal detail of the events that transpired. As she showed the farmhouse to the police, and it was a farm, as it turned out, that belonged to Alan Fryer's employer. And then, as if by fate, Alan drove past the scene in the very same brown pickup truck from the night of the murders. Sandra pointed him out, and within hours, all 3 brothers were arrested. During interrogations, the stories kept on changing. Alan claimed the teen shot at him first, but one by one the brothers caved. David ultimately pled guilty. He admitted to killing Stewart Bade and was sentenced to life without parole. Alan Fryer was found guilty of all 4 murders and received 4 consecutive life sentences, but not before attempting a daring jail escape with James, which ended in their rearrest in Wyoming. And James Fryer was sentenced to 3 life terms plus 8 years for manslaughter. All 3 brothers remain behind bars to this day, thanks to a 13-year-old girl who refused to be silenced. Number 2. The Vanishing. It's one of Argentina's most haunting mysteries. A whole family, 6 people in all, vanished without a trace. And that eerie silence has now lasted more than 2 decades. The story begins on a quiet stretch of farmland in Entre Rios province. And tucked away from the buzz of city life, the Gill family lived and worked on a 1,200-acre estate known as La Candelaria. Reuben Gill, his wife Margarita, and their 4 children weren't rich or powerful, and they were humble rural workers, employed by a man named Alfonso Goetti. And then, on the night of January 12, 2002, they just disappeared. On the evening before their vanishing, the Gills were seen visiting a friend in the nearby town of Viale. That was the last confirmed sighting of any of them, and no one, not neighbors, not co-workers or relatives, would ever see them again. And 3 months later, in April, their employer Alfonso casually contacted the family's relatives to say that the Gills hadn't returned from the 3-month vacation he had supposedly given them back in January. But the Gills had never been given such a long break before. In fact, according to Reuben's sister, Luisa, they'd never had more than a couple weeks off at a time. The estate needed them just to function. So Luisa didn't buy it from the start, and she filed a police report, and that's when the strange and deeply troubling details began to surface. Well, let's start with Reuben's phone. Well, records show that on January 13th, the day after they were last seen, calls were made from his cell to a woman in Rosario. And the police couldn't track her down, and the call stopped after that, but the phone, well, it stayed active for 15 more months. So someone had it and kept it on, yet no one came forward, and back then GPS tracking wasn't anything close to what it is today. A neighbor named Villanueva later claimed he saw Reuben riding horseback near the estate the very next day. That would have been January 14th, and if true, it would suggest Reuben was alive at least a day after the supposed disappearance, though that sighting was never confirmed. By mid-2003, the case still had no answers. Then, finally, Judge Jorge Galino ordered an official investigation, and it didn't go well. The Gills, as it turned out, had no vehicle of their own, so the idea that they had left on their own was far-fetched. Margarita, who worked at a local school, hadn't picked up her last paycheck, and every single one of their personal belongings, money, ID, clothing, was all left behind. It would take a few more years, but finally in 2008, police raided La Candelaria, and they dug up the floors and searched the wells, and they used luminol, a chemical that reacts with blood, and it lit up the place. 3 separate samples of human blood were recovered, though none could be matched to the Gill family. The samples were just too degraded and too contaminated, but the evidence was there. Something violent had definitely happened. And there were flies as well, the kind that hover near decomposing human remains, but again, no bodies. In that same year, investigators turned to something called a psychological autopsy. That's a forensic method that analyzes a person's state of mind based on interviews, diaries, and behavior. The findings? Well, the family showed no signs of mental instability, no religious fanaticism, and no reason to disappear willingly. Reuben, they said, was a friendly, sociable guy, but a few witnesses remembered him acting strangely in the days before the disappearance. Quiet, distracted, even a bit worried. A contractor named Armando came forward saying Reuben, whom he saw in the days leading up to the vanishing, said that he was being told by his boss to dig some wells along the property, but that he didn't want to do it. And could it be that those wells were actually going to be the graves for his own family, and Reuben actually knew it. According to Louisa, the sister, she went to the estate to pick up all those belongings that her family had left behind. But when she got there, she says they found something else entirely. The mattresses, for one, where the family slept, were all gone. When pressed, Gitchy admitted he'd burned them because they were trash. No report was filed at the time she reported this. And according to Reuben's brother Osvaldo and Margarita's mother, there had once been a basement beneath that house. After Gil's disappearance, they claimed Gitchy filled it in and built over it. A strange renovation, to say the least, if true. Despite all the suspicions, no hard evidence ever connected Gitchy directly to the disappearances. And he died in a car crash in 2016, swerving off the road and flipping his truck on accident. And so, were the Gil family members victims of their wealthy boss? Perhaps they had uncovered something they shouldn't have. Or did they really go on a vacation and just extend it for the next 23 years? With no bodies, no witnesses, and a key suspect long gone, the truth is likely buried forever beneath the soil of La Candelaria. Number 1. The strange death of Morgan.
Is it possible that she accidentally overdosed?
No, you know how many drugs were in her body? There were drugs that we never had in our house. She could have gone into our cabinet anytime.
They say your home is where you're supposed to feel the safest. But what happens when it becomes a cage and the threat is just outside your window? On the morning of December 2nd, 2011, in the mountain town of Carbondale, Colorado, Steve and Tony Ingram woke up to find their 20-year-old daughter Morgan lying lifeless in her bed. And there had been no screams in the night, nor signs of break-in, and none of it made sense. The Garfield County coroner's initial report was clear: natural causes. They said Morgan had died in her sleep from a rare genetic disorder, acute intermittent porphyria, a disease known for causing seizures, confusion, and intense abdominal pain. But the thing about it is, she had never been diagnosed with the disease, so her parents pushed back. They pushed hard enough because 8 months later, the official cause of death changed. Suddenly, Morgan's death wasn't being labeled a medical mystery anymore. Now it was ruled an overdose of amitriptyline, a powerful prescription antidepressant. Was it accidental or intentional? Well, that would take more investigating. But still, there was a problem with this, because Morgan wasn't taking that medication. Her parents immediately pushed back again. They weren't just grieving parents in denial. They had reason to believe their daughter had actually been murdered, and they believed they know who did it. Morgan was 20 years old at the time, a former ballet dancer and passionate about photography, animals, and family. And she was sensitive, curious, and according to her parents, full of life. There were no medical issues and no signs of depression. What there was, though, was something darker. A 4-month-long campaign of fear that her parents say culminated in her death, and they say Morgan was being stalked. According to the Ingrams, it started with tapping on the windows at night, then shadows lurking outside the house. Eventually, Morgan began keeping a diary, documenting every strange occurrence, every incident that made her feel hunted. Security cameras were then installed, lights, motion sensors, and even police reports, dozens of them. But according to the family, law enforcement never took it seriously. And Morgan began sleeping with a knife underneath her pillow. And she stopped going out, and her parents said she was terrified, not depressed. And then she was gone. When Tony found her daughter that morning, she said Morgan didn't look peaceful, like someone who had drifted off to sleep. She claims there were bruises on her body, blood around her mouth, and signs, she says, of a struggle. But those observations were never formally documented in the autopsy. But there was a toxic dose of that antidepressant in her system. That can't be denied. So, where did it come from? Well, Steve and Tony insist Morgan hadn't taken that medication in over a year. And they claim it wasn't in the house. Was it secretly administered to her, planted somehow, or had Morgan really taken it herself? As public interest in the case grew, so did the theories. Was Morgan suffering from something her parents didn't fully understand? Or had she been slowly unraveled by fear and by the constant anxiety of being watched, followed, and hunted? Some have even suggested both could be true, that the trauma of being stalked drove her to being in that terrible headspace. But others point to something more sinister, that her stalker just finally got to her. And Tony and Steve believe the man who had been harassing their daughter for months found a way inside the house that night. They think he drugged her and killed her, and possibly without leaving a trace. And in the years since, they've taken their fight public, posting on blogs and speaking to media, even appearing on national TV. And their goal, ultimately, is to get Morgan's case reopened as a homicide. As to whether or not that will happen, only time will tell. So that's going to do it for this episode. And be honest, how many of those did you really know about? The world is a crazy place. There's always something strange going down in this world that's hard to even fathom. Hopefully you don't ever find yourself caught up in a situation like these. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you all over in the next episode.